first things first, and I'm just going to tell you why I picked that topic for my talk. Well, as I was reading the top blogs and going through the CakePHP documentation, I just noticed that there's not too much information yet about unit testing in general. And especially on the temporary documentation for CakePHP 1.2, there's nothing yet. And I'm pretty excited about the CakePHP cookbook because I think it's going to contain some information about unit testing. And yeah, the reason why I'm giving this talk is that people who read the top blogs regularly find that the information on unit testing is quite spread across them all. So there's not a blog or a blogger that does most of the things on his blog himself. So I just thought it would be good to prepare some slides that contain plenty of information about unit testing and then many code samples and then get away with that. Okay, so there are three main goals for this talk. First off, we are going through the basics again. I think that's not so interesting for you because I think, well, most of the people here sitting in a Zoom are pretty advanced developers, but maybe it will serve as a reminder for you to unit testing and to see it all again, what it is about. The second part of the talk will deal with the actual CakePHP test suite. So we are going to look at, well, how to get it up and running, how to download the package. Well, not how to download it, but well, how to install everything, simple test. And then we'll have a look at the CakePHP test classes that are involved. And then we'll deal with testing models in CakePHP, testing controllers, testing components, and all that kind of stuff. And for the third part, I thought it would be useful maybe to present you some things that helped me when I was unit testing. And also to talk about the theory a little bit, when to use testing, when not, what to test, and what not. Okay. So who am I? I'm Tim, well, Koschuetzki. It's actually not that bad to pronounce. And my friends call me Timmy, which is sort of funny considering my size. And I'm currently 21 years old, coming from Berlin, Germany. So you see, I'm not a native English speaker. So if I'm talking like a crap and the choice of words is pretty bad, well, just lift your finger by all means and tell me. And I'm going to paraphrase what I was saying. I sometimes blog at phpcodingpractices.com about, well, what the domain name already implies. And yeah, currently I'm studying computer science and business administration and I'm in my first semester. So that's the reason why I'm currently mostly into Java programming and computer science theory, which sort of, well, makes me unhappy. Yeah, and it was only recently that I teamed up with Felix, one of the main contributors to the CakePHP core, to found our first company together. It's called Debuggable Limited, and we are currently working on our first product, which is called posttest.com. And we think it's going to be quite a revolutionary task management application. The reason why I'm mentioning it is because plenty of the code examples throughout the talk are taken from posttest.com. So I thought CakeFest is about building real stuff, and PostTask is real, and yeah, use that. Yeah, I've been playing with PHP for 5 years, and my experience with CakePHP is about 1.5 years. Okay, part one, introduction to unit testing. So, okay. According to Wikipedia, unit testing is an automated procedure to ensure your software units work properly. And you might wonder what units are. Well, there are two types of units actually. If you go the procedural way of programming, then your functions are considered the units. Because a unit in general is the smallest testable unit you got in the system. And if you go the object-oriented programming way, as like most of us are doing, I think, then the units are the object methods. So how does it work? Well, actually, it's pretty simple. You just put in your input into an assertion, and then the second parameter is your function called, your unit, with some parameters. And then the assertion compares the result of the unit with the expected result. So pretty simple, actually. And how do you know about the expected result? Well, that's simple as well. You are the programmer. You are supposed to be knowing what you're doing, and you have to know what your units are supposed to do. So next up, we are going to look at some of the features of unit testing. The goal is to write unit tests that are loosely coupled, so that they do not interact with each other, and the order you are running them is not important at all. So that you get, when you have two test cases breaking, you get two different problems. The good news is that unit testing is pretty fast. You can run the test cases over and over again. It's a pretty lightweight approach and easy to use. So there's usually not that much configuration needed. You just load the classes you need, then they are supposed to load the classes they need, and then it's going to work all together. Yeah, that's pretty obvious. If a test case fails once, it should fail again when you run it again. So there's a consistent pass-fail rate and no funny stuff about that. And yeah, you can run test cases alone, or you can group them together and define entire subsystems of tests and then have them run constantly when you get a test case failing regularly in one of the subsystems, or if that particular subsystem is pretty important, like the payment system, you may want to run that test case group pretty often. What I find is pretty important is that you run the entire test suite all at once. Because unit testing is only about unit testing, it's not integration testing. So the ultimate goal of unit testing is to have all units working. But then again, there might be issues when you integrate them all together. There might be some dependency problems and that stuff. So I like running the test suite all the time. And I even wrote a group test that runs the application tests and the Cake core test cases at the same time. So when you SVN up CakePHP, you're always seeing, when you run your application tests, that if there's one test case failing in the core or not. Well, unit testing is cool because seeing a green bar is cool. It makes you self-confident. It's cool. And yeah, the good news is also that when you get a red bar, you got work. It's pretty obvious. If you have a test case failing, well, you gotta fix it up. All right, the basics of unit testing. Well, as I said earlier, it's working with assertions. They're pretty basic, and I think you know them all. Assert true, assert false. It just compares the parameters some way. For example, we got assert equal here. It passes if the two parameters are equal, and then you get assert identical, which compares them with the strict comparison operator. Yeah, and then the negation of that, assert not identical, or test if two variables are references to each other, assert copy. And then the next two are pretty cool, assert wanted pattern and assert no wanted pattern. Well, essentially, it's an assert true of a preg match. So sometimes when you don't want to use the assertions of simple test, you just may use assert true and use the corresponding function of CakePHP, of PHP, sorry, like preg match or something like that. All right, so some very basic simple test example. I thought it would be cool to write a function to calculate the travel expenses, for example, for CakeFest. So we are going to have three variables: the flight price, the hotel costs, and other expenses like foods, drinks, and that stuff. So and then we put in a 10% buffer, because from my experience, it's always good to have, well, more money with you than you actually are going to need. So we end up with the following formula. The result should be 110% of the sum of our three variables. It's pretty clear, I think. So that's the code I was writing for that. Maybe you want to take a look at it yourself a little bit. Can you actually read it?
Yeah.
So we define some constant buffer rate, or 10%, then have our function, calculate travel expenses, we get our 3 parameters, sum them up, and then take our percentage out of them. And here's our first test case. Test methods that are run by SimpleTest usually start with the string test. We will see later on how to modify that, so you can have your own test rule. And then we are using the assert equal, and if you sum 600, 400, and 200 up, we get 1,200, and then add 10% to it, that would be 120. So we should add up with 1,320. All right, let's see. It's failing. Why is it failing? Can anybody tell me?
No dot in front of the equals.
Pardon?
No dot in front of the equals. You only multiplied the buffer by that.
All right, I'm just going back.
You didn't add the. You just multiplied the buffer rate by the sum, so all you have is 10%.
Yeah, that's good, but yeah, that's at least that's the second error. But there's actually one before, according to that failure method. So what is wrong here? 100 and 1,320 differs from 0. Oh. So why do we get 0? No return statement? Yeah, that's correct. So now we get the error you were talking about already, that we are using 10% and not 110% of that sum. All right, so we get a green bar, we are happy, and we are self-confident. Well, I gotta love that smiley actually. So what are some of the benefits of unit testing? I think one of the most important things is that before you code, you really have to think about it, what you are going to do. At least when you are using test-driven development, and we are getting to that in a minute. Yeah, but even if you are using unit testing as an afterthought, like CakePHP did, it's still very useful because you have to think about what your code was supposed to do again. And well, one of the benefits is also that having a machine test your code is always going to be more accurate and faster than when you're testing it with a team of like 10 people in the browser all the time. And yeah, and because of that, you save money, you make your managers happy, and well, you're going to be a better developer and may end up with more money yourself. Two other important benefits of unit testing are that it's sort of a living documentation, I think. So you just look at the test of a unit, then see, okay, the code is supposed to do that, and when you're good enough, you can actually picture that the code that is supposed to pass, let those tests pass in your mind. And another one is that, well, when you're using test-driven development, so that you test first, you sort of drive your design already. But we'll get to that in a minute. Some of the limitations of unit testing, well, unit testing is not going to catch all your errors. It's just some kind of proof that there are bugs in your code or that some unit is not working properly. And you cannot catch all errors. For example, as I mentioned earlier, when your units work all properly and you get a fine test coverage, then you still might end up with integration problems. And you also cannot test the performance of your system with unit tests. You gotta use different tools for that. Yeah, security is pretty obvious. Unit testing is not a proof that your system is secure. Of course, you can, for example, test whether your database layer is actually escaping every statement that's coming in. But you are not going to prove with unit testing whether there is no attack out there, maybe also in the future, that is going to well, crack your system. Yeah, unit testing shows the presence of errors, not the absence, so it's not a mathematical proof that your system is bug-free. Yeah, I'm asking you, would you use it? I think everybody should. It's pretty cool. Just test it out. One word about the assertions in simple test again. There's a way to define your own failure message. Here we see that as the third parameter. Okay, so this is a pretty exciting test. So it just shows up here, but it does not show the default error message again. So how are we going to use that and embed it as well? Well, Marcus Baker, who is the author of Simple Test, uses the sprintf or string print format function to allow you to put that percentage sign and an S in there. And then the default error message gets embedded as well. So a few words about test-driven development. Test-driven development, as the name implies already, is about writing your tests first. You write a test, write the code after that, and be fine with it. You drive your design, and yeah, you actually write the test before, do the assertions first, and then think about the interface you're going to design before you actually do it. And yeah, with test-driven development, there are two approaches actually. I got from Callback from his book, Test-Driven Development by Example, that are called triangulation and fake it till you make it. So you just can write the simplest implementation that is going to let your tests pass, and then go from there, add to the test, add to your implementation, and that sort of results in a cycle. Like you get a green bar, you fix it up, you get a red bar, you fix it up, you get a green bar, then refactor the code, add to the tests, you get a red bar again, then green bar, that stuff. Yeah, as I said, you are going to think about your interface first, design that first, and then get a clear picture of what the client code that is going to use your interface might look like. Yeah, some of the problems I see when using test-driven development or unit testing in general with CakePHP, because of CakePHP's MVC working so well, it's very difficult to get into the habit of testing. So when you get quite simple applications that are just making use of the MVC pattern, you just plug in a controller, then a model, design the view, and be done with it. So there are so many obvious implementations. You don't need unit testing for them very much. Plenty of the time, not always, of course. Yeah, and due to the MVC pattern, you have very few things that actually have that kind of contract, the mapping between input and output that is so needed to unit test them correctly. Because, well, let's remember, unit testing is about putting in some input and then compare it to the expected result. Yeah, and then when you get to advanced stuff like proper redirecting or multi-page processes and web development in general, it's pretty hard to test that because you have to know simple test very much, know the CakePHP test suite pretty much, and maybe you are going to need quite some configuration, many classes, and it's going to be difficult and taking up a whole lot of time, well, and thus money. Yeah, what I was saying, it's very difficult, for me at least, to get into the habit of testing CakePHP. All right, so let's have a look at the CakePHP test suite. It's pretty easy to set up. As I said, it's now these days heavily tied and dependable on simple test. Maybe that's going to change in the future. So you have to download simple test, put that into your app vendors folder or Cake vendors. Cake is smart enough to pick the correct installation directory. Then you end up with a simple test folder and that should contain all the simple test files. Yeah, then you set the debug level in your config file to at least 1. Well, it makes sense. And so that no production environment is seeing the tests. And then you go to app webroot test PHP and then end up with that screen there. So at the top you get the Cake core tests and then the app test cases and groups. And then you're gonna choose what you want to test or want to check and then be fine with it. So the actual folder layout for testing CakePHP. Yeah, there are 3 main folders: cases, fixtures, and groups. And the case folder has behaviors, components, controllers, helpers, and models. So like the rest of CakePHP, the folder layout is pretty structured as well. And well, according to that folder layout, it's pretty obvious where you're going to put a controller test, for example. Yeah, there are two types of tests in CakePHP: the test cases and the group tests. Test cases, by definition, are simply some kind of sequence of tests, some kind of class that has methods in it, functions, and the functions contain the assertions. And yeah, in Cake, it's basically all your unit tests for the different components of your subsystem. And you want to run each of them separately. So group tests, in Cake you get the ability to group the tests together, and I thought there are probably 2 approaches to that. On the one hand, you can set up a group for all behavior tests, then one for all controller tests, or you go the approach that the Cake core team is using, grouping the tests for different subsystems together. For example, in the Cake core, you get a group test for the cache system and one for the controller stuff. Yeah, you get the idea. In post-task, actually, we are going to do a group test for the payment system to have that run more often than the rest. Yeah. So what are you going to name your files? For test cases, I think it would be good to use the convention of a configuration again and just use the underscored version of your class name and then append .test.php to it. Examples are for the lookupable behavior by Felix, for example, lookupable.test.php or user.test for model or users.test for controller. With group tests, it's a little different because you can just use any name and then attach group.php to it. Cake is smart enough to find out, or well, to actually find the group tests according to that. So Cake's test system, what classes are involved? On the simple test side, you get unit test case and web test case. Those are the 2 main classes used in simple test, and they make usage of all kind of small classes, simple browser, simple socket. So simple test, as you see, is well pretty loosely coupled, and it has tests itself, so it sort of tests itself. On the CakePHP side, you get Cake test case, and it's a subclass of unit test case, so it inherits all the assertions, and you get Cake web test case, which extends the web test case class. Yeah, there's something special about it, but we're going to get to that in a minute. Yeah, CakePHP uses the Cake test model class, Cake test fixture that we are going to deal with later, and the test manager subsystem. The test manager is actually very useful when you want to compose group tests because it contains methods to add test cases from various paths. Yeah, what you are going to do is, oh, sorry. Yeah, the computer is sort of lagging right now. No idea why. So what you are going to end up is using the Cake test case class and the Cake web test case class mainly. Sometimes you are going to use the test manager class, but mainly those 2. Why is it lagging so much? All right. So let's have a look at them. The cake test case class contains some kind of callback methods that are run before every test method or before a test case is about to start, and then callbacks for the ending part of that as well. So when a test case has been executed, or when a test method has been executed. So for the test case method, it's start test and end test. And yeah, you also get before and after, which announce the start of a test. Well, what's that? That's pretty difficult actually. So I was playing with all these functions. Can you read that? Or is it too small?
Too small.
Too small? Oops. Well, sort of. Alright, so you get start case, end case, and it was just printing something on the screen when I'm in those functions. Oh, it's going to be pretty hard to actually maneuver like that. Well, anyway, you don't have to look at that one, because the result of that is much more interesting. Yeah, so the before and after calls, functions are called before any of the methods are called. So in your test case, so you get a start method and an end method, which is actually taking care of inserting the fixtures and cleaning them up again. Then the callback for start case is called. Then we are in start case actually. Then callback for that. Then we get our two test methods that are here at the bottom in the code, and have before and end, and after that called before and after that well. So apart from that, the cake test case class contains get test as well. That is actually pretty useful when you want to modify the rule how test methods are picked. As I said earlier, simple test picks the methods that start with the string test, but you can change it if we want to. Well, I for one don't see any need for that, but maybe it could be cool. And then there's test action, which is pretty useful for testing controllers, and that's going to make a whole chapter in itself later on in the talk. You also have start controller and end controller that are again taking care of fixture stuff, because when using test action, you can actually use a fixturize kind of thing to let the test suite browse through any of your pages, but not use your default database connection, but a test suite one. And then it's going to use that data from that database instead. So what about the cake web test case class? It extends the web test case class, but it's empty. So the only thing it does is inherit quite some cool assertions from the simple test web test case class. They're pretty useful when you want to do browser testing, browser simulation testing. For example, not sure if you can read that. You can assert whether the page title contains a specific string, or whether there's some kind of link on your page that contains some kind of alt text or some anchor text. And yeah, you get all sorts of nice stuff. What I like most is assert response, because you can use that to test for proper redirection functionality in your system. For example, what we are doing with post task is that when you get to /tasks and you are not logged in, you are redirected to a login form. Well, obviously. And if you are logged in, it's not doing that. So let's have a look at that example. First off, we define the URL, like /tasks. Then we import the user model well, pay attention to app import because that's the new way of importing classes. Then we create an instantiation of that, of the user class, log the user in, and then use simple test set maximum redirects function. Fetch the URL, and then it should be the header code 200, as in success. So what does set maximum redirects do? Well, actually, it's pretty simple as well, because you tell simple test to not follow any redirection. So even if there is any redirection, you get the response header of that redirection. For example, here, when we make the user log out, then set the maximum allowed redirects to 0, fetch the URL again, and then it shows up the first response after the first redirection. So we get a 302 error for redirection. Was it pretty clear? Or any questions so far? All right, here's another example. You get cookie there, then you can populate some form fields, set field, then actually simulate a click on a button, and the responding page should contain, for example, welcome me, and you're also testing whether the session ID is still the same. Well, yesterday evening I was sitting in the lobby with Travis Klein, and he asked me whether it's possible to actually fetch the redirection location and not only the response code. So I looked into simple test, and I found out that it's not possible. And well, sat down 1 hour and wrote a little extension to simple test. Now you can do that as well. So for example, when you simulate browsing to google.de, and that's the German version of Google, and it shall redirect you to the www version of it. And now you can test that as well. So when I'm going to make the slides available, I'm going to include that one too. Okay, the test manager class, as I told you earlier, is about composing group tests. You can actually fetch all the tests that are in your application, or run a specific test case, run a certain group test, or add the test cases from a certain directory. So you can group your tests together to your liking. Yeah, well, I put in some code, wrote some code that actually makes a group test for all the behaviors, all the controllers. So, yeah, just to serve an example. Oh yeah, gotta love that keynote. So we are using add test cases from directory, then specify the path to the behaviors folder, and then be done with it. Yeah, for controllers, pretty obvious. All right. So concerning the cool assertions in simple test, it would be quite cool if you could check that out yourself. There's plenty of good stuff in it, and you can actually do pretty advanced browser simulation testing, like you can do with the Firefox extension Selenium. Have you ever heard about that one? Selenium, well, it's a Firefox extension, and you can, well, sort of, it's a real-life debugger of your IDE. Check that out, it's pretty cool. But it's a whole talk in itself, and that's why I'm not going to cover that much for now. When you look at code samples in the Google group, it's always, or it often happens that people load their models wrong. The new way of doing so is using app import. Then the first parameter is the type of class that you want to load, and then the second one, well, the missing part of it. So as you can see, loading the user's controller is app input controller, then users, and likewise for the other two. Okay, let's come to the most difficult part, testing models and CakePHP. Where there are two goals. Actually, you want to not disrupt your real application data. You just want to set up some sample database connection, use sample data, and be done with it. And the second goal is when you use models as some kind of namespace objects. So you put in functionality that doesn't belong to any component, to any controller, but to a certain model. Like, for example, we are doing it in post task to have a login and the isGuest static function in the user model. So it's very important for testing models in CakePHP to understand the fixture system. So what are fixtures? Fixtures are a way to define sample data that's going to be used in your test cases. And it will automatically be loaded from your models if you so define it. And yeah, it's just a way to not use the real application data. CakePHP is going to check if the test connection is available in your database.php file. If so, it's going to use that. If not, it's going to use the default one. And it will add the prefix test suite in either case. So if you have no test connection available and CakePHP is going to use the default one, it will not use your real application tables, but create new ones and import the data from them and then add the test suite prefix to them. So the life cycle of a fixture is as follows. Before any test method is run, Cake creates all the tables. And no, that's wrong actually. Before any test case is run, Cake creates all the tables. Then before any test method is run, it populates the tables with the fixture data that you specified. After running any test method, Cake empties those tables again, and when the test case is done, it drops the tables all together again. So actually, for every test case and every method, you get new, fresh, untouched data. So creating fixtures is pretty easy. You just define the table structure and provide some records that are going to be imported. Creating the table structure is some kind of mapping to the SQL equivalents. So you can specify string text, and it's going to map to the corresponding data type in SQL. So it's a very good setup, I think, pretty easy to use. Yeah, and you can also specify just the other things that I would do in SQL. Provide a primary key, provide the length of a data field, provide whether it can be null or not, and set a default value. So here's an example. Can you read that? Yeah? Okay, so we have a plan fixture that extends the Cake test fixture class. Where we are making up for PHP 4 there with the name variable. And then we have fields and records. Fields provides the table structure in an array-like format. So you have, for example, for the post-task plans, we have ID, name, label. The amount is actually the price. And then the default created an updated fields. And where we are going to import 4 plans for now. We have a free plan, then the magic box plan, the guest plan, and the expensive plan. The expensive plan is not actually in the application, but it's just something we are going to use now for that example. So the free plan has an amount of 0. So does the guest plan. The magic box plan costs $7.95, and the expensive plan, just for this example's sake, costs $10. So when we import that, you can also import table information. There are different, in fixtures, there are different kinds you can use. You can actually import copies of the records of your actual default database, or you can only import the table structure but define the records as we are doing in that array kind of format, or you can just specify a model to import from, or a specific table name and a different connection. So you can actually not use the test suite database connection, but use an entirely different one, if you so choose. So here are examples for that. When you're importing by model, you just write var import, and then the model, plan in that case. You can, well, when you want to use the plan model's records as well, you have to specify an array and then transform the plan string we were using into a key model and then the value plan. That's importing from a table based on table name, and here based on table name and records as well. And here's importing based on table name and a different connection. So what you can also do is that when you use a test action, you can ask CakePHP to fixturize your output, so that when you simulate browsing to that page, it's going to use fixture data, but not the real data. So you just specify fixturize 1 and be cool. So getting back to our example using the fixture. Here's the code again. And now we are creating an actual model for that, like plan. And we have a function there, find expensive. So we are going to find any plan that has a price greater than $9 and return that. So the test case could look like that. Class plan test case, you specify that you're going to use the plan fixture. Then we have the test method, test plan find expensive. Get a new instance of the plan model. Get a result of the find expensive function. And then we expect to find the expensive plan, because the find expensive actually returns all plans that have a price greater than $9. And expensive was the only plan that fulfills that condition. And when using assert equal, we should get an array that looks like that back. But it fails. And okay, this is pretty advanced if you are not used to fixtures, but anybody has an idea what can have gone wrong? I mean, I was talking about importing all the table information and default connection, test connection. So that's the actual problem. We created an instance of the plan model that is in the application. And you know, when you know about models, there is that variable useDBconfig. And that's set to default by default. And that's why we are actually using the table information from the actual application and not the fixture that we wrote. So what are we going to do? We have to create a plan test model that extends the plan model, and then tell it to use the test suite DB configuration so that it's going to use our fixture. We have to alter that. The fixture plan test is used. And yeah, basically you have to rename everything that was called plan previously to plan test. And yeah, so you see plan test fixture was renamed to plan test. Plan fixture was renamed to plan test fixture, and now it should work. It does. So what's the reason to use fixtures actually? Well, there are quite many cases. When you are developing an application that's not in production mode yet, and you don't have any real application data yet, you might want to use fixtures to simulate how your application is going to behave when it's put live. And then you also may want to test edge cases of your data. So when specifying fixtures, you're pretty free as to what data you're putting in. And another usage case for fixtures is to prevent the use of mock objects. Mock objects are objects that act as an actor and a critic. So you can basically make them respond to certain calls. Like you can make them expect a call to a certain function like 3 times and then test if your object, your real object you are testing is actually doing that. But mock objects themselves are a pretty advanced topic, and I think it's not going to fit here because they could make up an entire talk in themselves. Okay, how to test controllers in CakePHP. Well, you do that all with the test action method of cake test case. You can analyze the view variables that your controller set, or analyze the entire response from the browser and check if there's some specific text in it. And you can, as we saw earlier, optionally use fixture data. And you can also set an array of URL variables. And what you can do is specify the method that is used, either get or post, so you can actually simulate a form submission with test action as well. So yeah, here's an example. Test action used on the URL /signup. The second parameter is the options that you are providing test action with. In that case, we are using return render, so it's just going to render the result onto the browser. Here for the sign up page of post task, well, it's pretty messed up right now because the cake test suite uses the cake.generic.css file, and well, that's what it's going to look like when we use that one. You can also specify key bare. Then it will get rid of all the JavaScript, all the CSS you're supplying it, and then only return the actual contents of your page. And here to return a controller vars, you specify return vars. And you get a nice array of all the variables that your controller set. In our case, we set a beta test 1, and where the message stuff is pretty advanced, so we are not going to bother about that right now. Yeah, testing components. There's not much to it. Here's one of the components we are using in post task. It's a message component to bring some kind of box onto the browser with feedback, like well, okay, you added that task correctly and everything went wrong, everything went correct, and yeah, so the startup method should be pretty familiar to you. And then we have an add method, which gets text and type, and then we just set an array as a controller var. So how we are going to test for that if when you use the message add function, it correctly adds a message as a controller var. So what we are going to do is provide the user's test controller, specify that it's going to use the view message component, and then we have the message test case. we are getting a new instance of the user's test controller there, initialize its components, and then call startup on the view message component. Then we get our test function, test request allowed, for example, and have a text and a type added as a message, and then we can asset equal based on controller vars. And it should be an array, where it's using the fancy compact function there, and it should be equal. And it actually is. Okay, so part 3 of the talk. Some stuff I think is going to happen when unit testing CakePHP applications, and also some words about test coverage. Well, my perception is that getting or aiming for 100% test coverage is not the thing you want. Well, let's face it. Getting 100% test coverage means that you really test every line of your code, every if and else statement, and when you end up with a pretty large application, there are going to be thousands of those. So you're going to write many thousand lines of test code, and I'm not really sure whether that should be what you should be aiming for, because well, I'm not saying that you shouldn't aim for 100% test coverage altogether. You should aim for it, but 80% test coverage is good as well, and you might get off with that nicely as well, and not spend like hundreds of hours just getting to 100% test coverage. And yeah, you should try to do as much automatic testing. That's at least my perception. It very much helps. It saves a lot of time, and yeah, you'll be fine with it. So what to test and what not to test in CakePHP applications? Well, I think you should test everything that can be easily testable. For example, everything that has the clear contract, the mapping of input and output, so you can use the basic use case of unit testing. You just provide the input and then compare with the expected result. If some user of yours reports a bug, you might as well put a test case for that one as well, so it's not going to happen in the future again. And yeah, when you have an application with a payment system or a medical application, you may want to use very many test cases, because the consequences of one of the components of that website failing could be pretty bad. And I use unit testing for testing everything I'm not confident about. If I look at the function and I'm not quite sure how it behaves or what it should do, like, just write a couple of test methods for it, and then you'll be fine and understand it way better. What I think you should test in a browser is when you simply have a controller method and a view for that that's providing an index for tests, for example, and when there are no tasks yet, there's a no test found message. You shouldn't do that with unit testing, I think. You should just go to the browser and check for that. After all, it's a simple if-else statement, and well, if you don't get that right, it's pretty bad. And what I was saying earlier, the MVC implementation of CakePHP is pretty slick, and you can rapidly develop any application and just plug in a controller, a view, a model, and be done with it. So what I'm questioning actually is whether you should test the controller vars. In simple cases, I think no. If you just have a function that sets like one controller var, you're not needing a test for that. If you end up with a controller function that has quite a lot of application flow to it, lots of if-else statements, you might want to test it. But it's not very usual, I think. And yeah, your browser interface, when you get lots of JavaScript and forms, that stuff, I think you can do most of that in the browser as well and not use unit testing for that. But I might be wrong on that one. Of course, please prove me wrong. Yeah, and what most often you don't need to test or can't. Well, the first one is quite controversial. I think CakePHP is going to be very stable. That's what Garrett's been telling us. And I think you are not supposed to SVN up daily and put that new revision of CakePHP that was just committed into production mode. I mean, well, that's what we get releases for, after all. And I think you shouldn't test any of Cake's code because it has quite a good test coverage right now. Like, I think 60% or 70%, I'm not sure really. Yeah, whether your site withstands all security attacks. As I said earlier, there's always going to be a way to crack your system. I think it's impossible to really make your application so that it can withstand any security attack. So I'm not saying you shouldn't test any security-related stuff, but probably don't want to aim for testing it to its knees. Yeah, last one I said already, controller wars. Okay, so the last part of the talk is some stuff that helped me when using unit testing. As I said earlier, it's very difficult to get into the habit of testing in CakePHP because its MVC approach works so well. But a constant motivator for me is that you think of the following vicious cycle. When you're under pressure, when you get stress, you are doing testing a little less. Then you make more errors, get more stress, and it all starts again. And what I'm doing is I actually wrote that motivator on a sheet of paper, and it's normally right on top of my monitor. And then when I just don't feel like testing anything, I'm going to look at it, read it a couple of times, and then it helps me again, and I'm going to write tests. Yeah, unit testing is all about keeping them isolated. So when you have two broken tests, it should mean to you to have two problems. And the next one I find pretty useful as well. When you write any test down on a little list, on a little sheet of paper, you are being a lot more conscious about what you are doing right now. Because when you are in a session programming and then a sudden idea pops up in your head, and you may be wondering about it, whether you should implement it or not, just write it down on that list and get to it later. So that keeps your head free of any additional problem, and then just focus on the stuff you are working on right now. Yeah, the next one goes without saying. Testing first really helps. Writing the assertions first is a pretty good way because you think about that public interface before you write any of the test code. And you can actually drive your design with that. Yeah, well, use fixtures to prevent mock objects. That's what I like doing because I don't like mock objects that much. And yeah, you can test, you can prevent disrupting your real database and just use sample data. What I like doing as well is doing regular breaks. There's some cool program for the Mac here that is called timeout. You can actually specify that you are going to work for 1 hour and then take a 5-minute break. That really helps to keep you focused and mentally fresh when doing programming and unit testing. And yeah, next one is sometimes it just won't work out. Your code is a mess, it just doesn't work, or you're looking at someone else's code and it just doesn't work. Why not rewrite it? Why be hesitant and not rewrite it from scratch? Most of the time, you get things done a lot more faster then. And yeah, if for some reason you want to narrow down the test methods that are failing, for example, when you get 5 test methods failing, and you want to really keep a close eye on that one method, you can put an X in front of it, and then it's not passing the filter of selecting any method that starts with the string test. So that might work out as well. The next one is very controversial. I think what helps me is when I'm programming alone on a project, you should always leave the last test case broken. Because when you're in a session, you build up your mental state, you wrap your head around the problem, and it takes quite a lot of time. And then when you leave it there, give it a rest, and then coming back later, can take quite an amount of time to build up that mental state again. So what I do is leave the last test case broken, or leave any test case broken that I was recently working on, and then I see, all right, that code was supposed to do that, I gotta fix that up, and I can quickly recover that mental state again. Unit testing is actually supposed to be run from the command line, and what I did is I wrote a test shell so that you can actually run your cake test cases from the command line. And it's pretty useful because you can write bash scripts as well to have your tests run automatically overnight. Or for example, when you want to test your cron jobs, when you get an application that deletes some data with a cron job, overnight you can actually use a test automation to see whether the cron job wasn't breaking anything. All right, I think that's going to be it. I'm going to upload the slides and the test shell and the sample code and all kind of stuff to my blog. And where you can download it there, use it or use it not, use it as a starting point, as some kind of filling the gap of the lack of documentation on unit testing. And well, thanks for your attention. Hope you liked it and took away something from it, and you can ask questions right now if you want to. Yeah?
How do you think the web tester compares to Selenium?
Pardon? The web tester compares what?
To Selenium.
Well, actually, I am not using Selenium that much. I like the web tester because you see the code there, really. You have it there, and it's better useful for test automation. In Selenium, where you can record that stuff, it's pretty useful as well, and then play it again and set breakpoints. I'm not sure. I don't like it as much. I have to figure out why, but I can tell you right now. Okay?
And just in the code there, you had a setup and teardown methods commented out one tests. Is that?
Pardon?
In some of the code there, you had a setup and teardown methods commented out. Is that because they've been replaced by the start test and end test?
I'm not sure what you mean. Sorry, I can't understand.
Okay. In some of the code that you showed there,
Yeah.
setup and then teardown commented out.
Yeah.
Is that because
that one. No, actually, setup and teardown is used by simple test.
Yeah.
But I wanted to keep the example quite easily because there are so many callback methods and they're not interfere with setup and teardown. But you can use that as well. But that's not from CakePHP, but from simple test. All right? Okay. Thanks for your attention.
We've got lunch in the room next door for everyone. Sit at a table where there's a glass and silverware. Should be plenty of seats.